55 years ago, an art student sauntered into a steam shed in search of a job, turning his back on the white-collar world in favour of one of the dirtiest jobs in Britain. Eventually, he found himself sailing along at the helm of engines like this. And more than half a century later, he's still there. At the age of 70, Clive Groome remains passionate about steam.
I got interested in railways because I lived backing onto a railway line, and I went to a school that backed onto a railway line. The result was that at home or at school, engines were going by, and I was either standing up in the class or rushing to the end of the back garden at home. Then some driver gave me a ride on the footplate and a hot cup of tea that left me with a burn on my tongue, and I knew that the only thing I wanted to do was work on engines. Not to be a driver, just to work on engines. It never occurred to me that I'd ever be an engine driver.
For the past 20 years, Clive Groome has been passing on to others his lifetime's experience. His footplate days and ways courses at railways like the Bluebell and Llangollen have introduced hundreds of people to life on the footplate. One by one, they take the controls.
Now your brake isn't off, you're not going fast enough. So you need to put it to the big jet. That's it, and until you pick up fast enough speed, you can't put it back. Get a little bit of a gallop on up to that junction there.
It must be Britain's most unusual classroom, with students riding in the guards van until it's their turn to try driving and firing. For many, it's a first step towards volunteering on a preserved railway. But for others, it's just something they've wanted to try since they were kids. And when Clive Groome isn't teaching, he's a volunteer himself. This week, to his delight, he's been rostered at the Bluebell with two of his daughters, Rebecca and Elizabeth, who are engine men in their own right. They'll be working a standard Class 4 tender engine up and down the Bluebell line on passenger trains. For Clive, it brings back memories from years ago when he would slip out of Nine Elms Shed in London in a cloud of steam, running light engine to Waterloo to work trains like the Atlantic Coast Express and the Bournemouth Bell. Back in those days, a crew would find their locomotive already in steam, and with some of the preparation done for them by the shed crew. Nowadays, there's more of a do-it-yourself role. The footplate crew will light their own engine up and do all of the oiling and fueling.
So I'm going to do what used to take us 20 minutes to do in the old days, and we were allowed 35 minutes to do it. We used to book on, look at the speed restrictions, things like that. You had about 10 minutes allowed for doing the notices. Very important. If you missed any of them and overran a speed restriction at high speed, you're in for the, well, death possibly. You had to find your engine. You walked across the shed to the engine, and there it was standing with about 80 pounds of steam. Of course, today we're lighting the fire because we haven't got any steam. But with 80 pounds of steam, the fireman could get that engine ready, and you could leave the shed 45 minutes from the time you walked into the shed. So a little dab of oil, and not much, on the buffer shank. There's not much there. A little bit down the head, so it doesn't wear when it's rubbing against the coaches. And then I walk back in a methodical way so that I miss nothing. I mustn't miss anything. And in here I've got a box. I flip the lid up, and there we've got a couple of trimmings. It's just worsted. And the worsted, by capillary action, will draw the oil up that I put in there and deliver it off the end of this bit of bent wire down the pipe and lubricate the bearing on that front pony truck. Now, trimmings are made out of copper wire, twisted, and into the twist is put a couple of tails of ordinary green worsted. Now worsted is used because the length of the filament of worsted is longer than other wools and it's very fine. So we just examine that to make sure there's no water in it. We examine the box that it goes into and make sure there's no water in that, and then replace it so that the oil will be siphoned down that pipe, and we replenish the oil with this feeder. Now you can imagine in the winter how thick and stiff that oil would be. It's not flowing very well today. So it's just coming up there now. Now what happens with these things, with the number of tails that I've got on there, they will actually draw oil up and deliver it at the rate of 3 drops a minute. At an average speed of 60 miles an hour, that's 3 drops of oil a mile. And that's all you need to keep an engine running, 3 drops of oil a mile.
While Clive is oiling up, Elizabeth lights the fire. The boiler water is already warm. It'll be a couple of hours before they have enough steam to leave the Sheffield Park shed. The routine in the cab is to build the fire up gradually, starting with those oily rags and then adding the coal and wood, while Clive gets on with his careful progress around the engine.
While we're in this position, we can look up above me and you'll see, up here, a mechanical lubricator. And this is the lubricator that pumps the oil through a ratchet and pull system driven off this rodding here to that expansion link there. So we've got a rocking action taking place through here, through a pull, submerged pumps going up and down in there, and on the outside we've got a sight gauge here so that we can see that we've actually got half full container. Just about on the level of my finger is where the oil rises to. Now I'm not going to fill it up too much because we don't use a lot in a day. I'll put in about, say, a quart of oil or so into that in a minute. And that's what feeds down through these pipes to oil the blocks that slide on these slide bars here. And it also comes down to here and oils the main slide bar for the piston. And while we're here, I'll just put my finger in there and rub. Now if that, instead of being black and shiny, was a sort of a leady colour or even a bronzy colour, it would indicate wear. There's no wear on that, it's just oil.
With a small fire established in the middle of the firebox, Liz now concentrates on laying down a bed of coal around it, until the whole floor of the grate is covered in a shallow layer of coal. Unlike a domestic fire, there'll be coal underneath the kindling wood. In this case, the wood is about 100 weight of smashed up pallets, which will help to encourage the fire. Soon, various engines in the yard are coming to life, and on some days, half a dozen of them will be waking up simultaneously. The fireman will need quite a collection of ironmongery to deal with his fire during the day.
Now the fire irons that we actually carry on the engine are 3 in number. The first one is the dart. Now this great big thing here with the pointed end on it is a Great Western dart, and they had darts which were extremely heavy. Look at that. It must weigh about 30 pounds. And you would thrust that through the door of the firebox and you'd aim it at the clinker, and if the clinker was a foot thick, you would bang and bang and bang until you tore a hole in the clinker, and then you push it forwards, lifting the clinker up all down the box. And it's hard, exhausting work. But remember, the other thing you've got to do with this is turn round and put it back on the tender. Now the cab is only at the most 9 foot wide. You mustn't hit bridges, you mustn't hit signals, and you've got to somehow pull it red hot out of the fire, turn it round in a 9 foot cab and put it back on the tender. Just imagine the difficulty of doing that. So that's the dart. Put it back up there. The next one is the pricker. This is a pricker. It's much lighter to handle and it can be up to 14 feet long. The end of it is about 9 inches and that is used firstly through the door of the firebox to level a fire over like that horizontally, and you can check when the flames are too violent and you can't actually see the firebed. You can feel what the firebed is like by placing this on it and running it down the shape of the fire. If the firebed is blocked up and the flames can't get through, you turn it point downwards and you pull the fire through with short jerks from the front of the box to the back of the box, and you break the surface of the coal. Last of all, at the end of the day, when you've dug the clinker up with the dart, you then use the pricker to lift the sheets up and push them in a place where you can get them out with the shovel. So that's the next thing we look at, the shovel. And here's the clinker shovel. It's a shovel on the end of a damn great bar. That's another one that I made, and again, don't look at the welds. They're not good welds, but they work. And you put that in through the door, you pick up some clinker on it, you pull it back out of the door, you turn round and you throw the clinker out the side of the cab. You were allowed an hour and a quarter to dispose of a Lord Nelson. And about 45 minutes of that hour and a quarter to 50 minutes was just throwing the fire out. And that was a hard job in the summer.
When Clive Groome first arrived at the Bluebell, he was pleased to see many of the locomotive types he'd worked on in steam days. Actual engines he'd worked on had escaped the scrapyard, so it was like being surrounded by a group of old friends.
Most of the machines here are types that I worked on. The C-class we worked on at Norwood, the E4 I worked on that very engine at Norwood, and so on. When I went to Nine Elms, I moved from Norwood to Nine Elms in 1954. I worked on the Bullied Pacific, Blackmore Vale, the standard Camelot, the S15s and so on. So there's not many engines here that I haven't worked on, including the 9F. The 9F was used at Nine Elms in the latter days of steam. So most of them are old friends.
One turn he remembers was working a goods train down to Basingstoke and then returning to Waterloo with a passenger working. But what makes Clive unusual was that he strayed to other regions. On the Western, he worked the Kings and Castles to Plymouth and back, a job quite unlike what he was used to on the Southern. And he went north, to Newcastle on the A4 engines, and to Glasgow on the Duchess and Pacific Express engines, firing other people's locomotives on his day off. He remembers it as an era of high excitement.
Well, the experience was better than any adventure film that you could ever imagine. I remember being at the cinema and thinking, while watching Errol Flynn doing some crazy exploits, I'm going to be having more adventure than this when I go to work at midnight. It was extremely exciting, extremely stimulating and challenging. And, well, spiritually, I've had people tell me that they've known ecstasy when they've been driving steam engines. Many, many drivers have said, yep, I've known ecstasy.
Nowadays it's a quieter life, but Clive still takes great pleasure in using the skills of an engineman. He's still learning about these machines after 50 years. And there's the added bonus of finding himself on duty with some of his 4 daughters, who really were railway children, and will hopefully carry on the family tradition when Clive retires, although at 70 he's still fit.
This takes a bit of pulling. Let it lay back a little bit. That's it. Okay. You can imagine when the platform's covered in ice and you're trying to get a grip with your heels, pulling that. Anywhere within a foot? All right, that'll do. Okay. Okay. And clear. Handbrake didn't go on, did it? Did it? Okay. Take it off now. All clear?
On the first trip, Clive will be acting as the fireman.
Assuming that the fire has been lit and is reasonably in shape, the fireman's job is to build up a firebed suitable for the work that's going to be ahead. And the firebed will be examined, the coal will be thrown around to get the right pattern for that engine, sloping, flat, dish-shaped or whatever. The steam pressure will be monitored so that it doesn't exceed the blowing off point before the departure, if they can help it. To that end, they keep the boiler water level low enough to be able to add water for half-inch increments every time the engine looks as though it's going to blow off at the safety valves. Fireman's work is the hardest to get to know because firemen aren't made in 5 minutes. I can pretty well teach somebody to drive an engine quite reasonably in a week, but firing takes years and years and years of experience, and all drivers start off as firemen. You'll hear these XBR chaps muttering on about getting a good back end in on the fire. And what they mean is getting the coal up to the door level or higher, because that's where the strongest draft is. And if we don't have a good back to a fire, the cold air will come through there and it won't bother to go through the rest of the fire. And the rest of the fire won't burn. So I'm doing my job, loading the shovel up for this little bit of the work, to make sure that in a minute or two's time when we leave, there'll be plenty of fire there to pull on. And you'll notice I'm tipping the shovel so I don't get any dust. Those are all lumps. Here we go. Shut the door. That'll do it. So now I'm going to have a look at the fire and see what it looks like. I can't see down the front, so if I put the shovel in the door so that air goes down the inside of the shovel, it'll actually move the flames out of the way. And looking on the inside of the shovel, you can see the edge of the fire, and if I turn the shovel that way, you can see that side. And what I can see is that the fire is very thin down the front 2/3 of the box on both sides. So I'm going to aim there first. The trick is to work on a fire so that flame comes through the whole of the surface cleanly and brightly, without smoke, without any thin patches where cold air will get through. And you work the fire in accordance to what's going to happen in the next 10 minutes. Because what you do doesn't really have effect for 10 minutes. So if you've got a bank approaching and you know the engine's going to be worked hard, you have to thicken the fire up before the bank in such a way that the extra coal doesn't cool the fire down. And in such a way that when the blast comes on the fire, there's sufficient fuel on the fire bed to withstand the blast and it doesn't draw holes in the fire. And so you're working away at this fire, and it's the most enjoyable and exciting job you can imagine. Coal is easy to shovel. It's not like clay or ballast or sand. It doesn't weigh a lot. It slips off the shovel through the door with a nice ring if you're doing it right. It cracks into the right place in the firebox, and the result on the pressure gauge is that the pressure rises and rises as you do it. So I was only putting 2 or 3 lumps at a time. You can keep on like that, and it's almost like an automatic stoker, and the fire stays at about 2,000 degrees.
The fireman's eyes are needed for the road ahead, especially on bends where the driver simply can't see the signals.
When the fireman's firing, through his feet he feels the twisting of the engine, and if he feels the engine tilting towards his side, he knows the track is turning that way, and he needs to look out and make sure it's clear, and if there's a signal to be seen, he sees it before the driver does. We've got the signal.
Like most preserved lines, the Bluebell is single track, and that means carrying a token for each section of the journey. It's their guarantee that there's nothing coming the other way.
Right, there we go, the blue one. I'll hang that up there. It's nice to be able to look and see it when it suddenly occurs to you, have you got it? They used to say, if you see a train coming towards you, die with that in your arms to prove that you had it.
The engine makes its first stop of the day after a 10-minute climb, which is a far cry from the long-distance expresses of steam days when non-stop journeys of several hours were commonplace.
I admire anybody who sets out on I mean, some of them, they did do non-stops to Glasgow. Very occasionally there was a non-stop run to Glasgow where the fireman could, on a bad day, shift 10 tonnes of coal. On a good day, probably 8 tonnes of coal. And that's some going. You know, you burn about a tonne for every 50 miles. And when you're firing, you're feeding this hungry brute that shouts at you in your right ear all the time. And you get tired and fed up with it after a while, and you think, you know, bloody hell, how much more do you want? It's all right if you're on good terms with the driver, and if you're in a good mood and you're feeling fit. It's a challenge that a young man enjoys meeting. But I know there are times when you think, here I go again, you know, yet more, and it all disappears, you know, it never fills up. You just keep shoveling coal through that hole, and the bloody stuff melts away and is digested by the engine and thrown out the chimney the other end. You have to be pretty in agreement with the driver that what he's doing is what you would do if you were driving, or what your best driver would have done. You get sometimes with a driver who does things that you know are not necessary, and then you get bad-tempered.
The train now arriving at platform 3 will form the 3:49 service to Sheffield Park. At the front of this train, behind the locomotive, is the London South Western observation coach, and you can travel in this coach if you hold a first class ticket, or payment of a supplement to the attendant travelling on board. The locomotive camera is pulling this train in and will form the 3:49 service to Sheffield Park. Platform 3.
There's simply no other working museum to rival Britain's preserved railways, whose achievement has been to make time stand still. It's pure nostalgia, a genuine walk down memory lane for the millions of people who have a fondness for trains. Clive Groome and his family consider themselves privileged.
Here we go.
Rebecca Groome takes the engine away as gently as possible, bearing in mind there's a sharp climb ahead. It's high summer, the countryside's dry, and they don't want to be throwing hot cinders from the chimney. For this section of the journey, Clive will adopt a different method of firing.
So Rebecca has wound the lever back a little and taken some of the blast off the fire. I'm going to start firing to it, but because of the danger of cold air going in the fire, I'm going to pretend to be a Great Western fireman and use that flap the way they do on the kings and castles.
This is another task that takes Clive back to his baptism of fire on the Great Western region, with its distinctive engines which had right-hand drive and a long, thin firebox.
it was very different, firing from the opposite side of the footplate, shoveling off the floor instead of off a shovel plate, shoveling into a box which was 11 feet long, using the shovel full of coal, maybe 14 pounds of coal on a shovel, which we would never do, and throwing the coal into a heap into the middle of the box. But the engine steamed perfectly because of the design of the firebox.
Today's engine seems to be responding well to the same treatment.
So you see, on a Western engine, there's no rubbish about firing small quantities. You load the shovel up, you have the door open only briefly, and you pop it in, and it works very well. I hope.
There's a tunnel on the second leg, and tunnels can cause blowbacks or make the engine slip.
Putting the blower on a little bit. Going in the tunnel again. Now we're coming out of the tunnel and we'll start going downhill. We'll shut off some coast very soon. The boiler's on the 160 mark now. And you'll see the boiler drop as we begin to coast. And as we put the brake on, it drops further. And Rebecca's job is to watch the water, to see how far she can put the brake on safely. The water aspect of a fireman's job is extremely important. There's no automatic pump that goes donka donka donk and feeds the boiler as it goes down. If the fireman's not watching, the boiler water will disappear. When you get to the top of a hill, you know that the change in gradient is going to drop the water down in the gauge glass. You've got to be prepared for that. If the driver brakes suddenly, the throwing forward of the water by the braking effort will expose the back of the firebox. So the fireman's got to be aware of the nature of the road, the likely actions of the driver on the brake or the regulator, and maintain the water through working the injectors. The injectors can be set on a long run so that they just put in as much as is being taken out, and the injector can be left running for 50 miles under those conditions. But more generally, firemen put them on for a mile or two and then shut them off.
Approaching the northern terminus of Kingscote, they're deep in the countryside, and the signalman leaves his little box with a pair of binoculars. He's not looking for the train, but for wildlife. Railwaymen always had a grandstand view of nature.
You saw every season, every kind of weather from the footplate, as no other person sees it. The best way to see the country is with a fire. It's lovely to be in the country, but 9 times out of 10 you're frozen. But if you've got a boiler with a fire blazing as well, you've got the best of all worlds. You've got everything. So we've got a fair amount of space in the boiler. We've got about half an hour to stand at the station, and if the steam climbs towards the blowing off point, we can poke some more water in and keep it quiet. We won't get any complaints from the neighbours.
The whole journey has evidently been accomplished without sweat. It doesn't have to be physical. Clive didn't even find firing on the western main line particularly hard. But then he was taught well by men who knew that sometimes half a shovelful would do the job.
The chap that taught me how to do that was Jim Dawson, who was an old Southwestern fireman and then driver, and he was my regular mate in number 3 link at Nine Elms. And when I started firing, I did the same as everybody else. I would throw on enough coal to actually turn the fire bed black. And he would say to me, no, cut down the amount of coal you're putting on. You only want half a shovel to that place. And I think, how the bloody hell does he know that? And I'd throw the half a shovel there, and yeah, the fire would gradually turn lemon yellow all over. And when you've got a fire like that, you think, yeah, this is the way to do it.
As a practical demonstration of firing at its most laid back, we can join a C-Class 060 engine which has been used on one of Clive's footplate training days in foul weather, the kind of day when enginemen don't want to make the job harder than it needs to be. Today, Clive's youngest daughter Elizabeth is acting as his fireman and has got the job down to a fine art, having literally grown up on the railways. The last duty of the day will be to shunt the yard. All good firemen will use the smallest fire possible. Apart from economic considerations, it's annoying to have to get rid of excess fuel.
Not a very nice day, thunder and rain, in an open cabbed engine, all very traditional. The only thing not traditional is the fact that I've got a girl for a fireman instead of a fella. But the job of fireman isn't as physical as you might think. It's an art, and if you've got the art, you don't need a lot of physical bulk to do it. In fact, Bert Hooker, who was one of the most famous firemen on BR, was a very slender and small chap, and he was an excellent fireman. The pattern that the fireman holds in his or her head is the vital element, and a good fireman will have a picture in their mind as to how the depth of the fire is reducing by the work of the engine. So without even looking in the firebox, the fireman will know when the next bit of coal needs applying. They watch the chimney to see how the smoke clears, and as the smoke begins to get less from the chimney, they know that the last charge of coal has burnt its carbon and it's time to add some more. If I look in that box there, there's places in the fire that are lower than other places. There's a hole to this side which is running thin, and so on. And the fireman looks for those places and throws the coal to them and nowhere else. So Elizabeth has made a plan now of the box in her mind, and she's going to basically fire to it and fill those holes in. There's one to the front left corner, one to the front right corner, one to the right again. He's done halfway down on the left, halfway down on the right, back right left side, and back right side, and one directly under the door. So there's a pattern to it.
In steam days, there was also a pattern to how the crew disposed of their engine at the end of the day.
All the engines that came into the shed threw their fires out, and the heap of clinker by the side of the engines was as high as the cab doors sometimes. Then you went under the engine, and hopefully in the pit you were able to get to the ash pan and rake the ash out. Now, some engines, as you probably know, have rocket grates where the ash and the fire is dropped through straight into the pit rather than being thrown out the side. Now, if you crawled under an engine which was stopped over a heap of red hot, you couldn't get to your ash pan because you couldn't climb over this heap of red hot clinker that was in the way. If the top of it was cold, you might take a chance at it, but if you broke through the top, then you were in for a burning. Your shoes would burn or your overalls would burn. There'd be a puddle of water the other side of that heap of red hot, sizzling away at the base of the heap, which might be 6 inches deep, trapped between two heaps of red hot. So the prospect of going underneath to rake out could be very daunting.
It was clearly a dangerous environment. Cleaners would be cramped underneath a hot engine, praying no one would move it. The easy bit was cleaning the outside, but that wasn't the first priority in steam days.
We didn't make a lot of fuss of the outside of the engine until the underneath of the engine was spotless. So the first thing the cleaners did, and especially the juniors cleaners, was to crawl underneath amongst the machinery that makes an engine go, sitting on the connecting rods and things like that, scrubbing away beneath the bottom of the boiler. And it seemed a very risky place to be, because you always thought that boiler is straining against the pressure within it. As an inexperienced cleaner, you thought this thing is pulsating with pressure just above my head. Your back was against the firebox, which was pretty hot if you made an incautious touch with your back to it. The rods you were sitting on were the rods that drove the engine along, and if somebody mistakenly moved the engine while you were in there, you were minced up. So, you know, it was a hairy position to be in. I've seen firemen, young firemen, in tears on the disposal pit. I've been in a state of absolute self-pity, and I've gone back into the lobby where my driver was waiting for me to say I'd finished with the engine. And he'd say, "Oh, there's another one out there, Clive, so the one behind you you've got to do now." And you just felt, surely somebody's going to help me or take pity on me, but they didn't, because everybody was doing the same work.
The fire will be allowed to die back overnight, and some of the cleaning tasks will be done now, ready for the morning.
Right, the disposal work is the bitter end to a day's work if you are on 8 hours. Having spent 45 minutes preparing it, half an hour taking the engine up to Waterloo, coupling up and then perhaps going 50 miles to Basingstoke. On your return, you go to Waterloo, light engine back to the shed, and then you've got to dispose the engine. It can all be done within 8 hours. And 8 hours was our day. So the first thing we do as a driver is examine the engine. So I look at everything, and I look for and smell hot places. I can smell the hot metal, I can smell, in the case of an engine with an inside valve here, I can smell the aniseed and the garlic. The paste I told you about, looking for grey paste. Feel the axle centres for heat. The axle centre there. Look for missing corks. That oil has gone down a bit from what we filled it up to this morning. We used about ½ an inch of that oil. And that's been going into the cylinders to keep them running nicely. I look at the piston rods. You can't see much of that piston rod. What you see is black and oily, but the shiny bit shouldn't be blue. Same with the valve spinners. The shiny bit of the valve spinner shouldn't be blue or black, otherwise it's running hot. And then the fireman opens up the smoke box door, and in the days of steam, that would have been 2 or 3 feet deep in ash. So as she opened the door, there'd be a line of ash going straight up, which may or may not fall on you as you open the door. Now, we've had an easy day's work. We've only done 56 miles. There's not much in there. Most of it's gone out the chimney. So she'll throw out the ash that she can reach with that shovel. She'll report to me any of the steam pipes that are leaking, and then shut the door and sweep it up nice and tidy again. It's not a pleasant job. We were allowed 10 minutes to do that, and when the wind's blowing the wrong way, it's 10 unpleasant minutes. This work isn't particularly heavy, but it requires determination and grit, because it's unpleasant. And you, at the end of the day, when you're covered in sweat, your legs are sticking to your trousers, your face is sweaty, the last thing you want is smoke box ash blowing all over yourself. So it's a matter of willpower and determination to do your duty is the hardest thing. You don't need strength, you just need strength of character. And that's what drivers and firemen developed in full, strength of character. So she's lining up the inside of the door catch, and then she'll put it down and then tighten up the outside. And then she'll have a little sweep round so that the dust doesn't blow in our eyes tomorrow. Was there anything blowing in there, Rebecca? Okay, no blows. And she's still got a white shirt.
Tomorrow they'll do it all over again. Clive has no doubt that firing is the most interesting job.
It's an art and a science, and the firing bit is more of an art than the driving bit. It's magic. It's production of power by your own skill and judgment. No, I think everybody that works on engines enjoys the firing bit more than the driving bit, really.
In the second part of this film, we'll be looking at the driving bit and how a couple of people with a shovel and an oil can are able to get the most out of these strange iron horses.